Welcome to the Light of Reason podcast, where we bring interesting philosophical topics to non-philosophy majors and the general public. I'm your host, Aaron Leitz, and I'm joined by my great two hosts today, Jay, Mike, and Jordan. How you guys doing?
Doing fantastic.
Good. Awesome. Me too. All right. Before we jump in, just like to have you guys maybe introduce yourselves, tell us a little about yourself, what you're doing on, what you're working on, and then we'll go from there.
Jordan, you want to start? I mean, sure. I don't know. I want to follow Jordan, I guess, is the question that I should be asking myself. Maybe I start because then I'm like the opening act because mine's not as impressive when we go there. My name is J Mike. I just do some YouTube and TikTok content, mostly on the atheist experience, where we have theists call in and talk about religion. We don't sometimes get into the philosophy of religion. A lot of times it's really just why people believe and kind of getting into the nuances of that. But then, I just enjoy it. I don't have a degree in philosophy, but I do enjoy engaging in it. So hopefully I have some 2 cents to throw in the bucket. So I'll leave it there.
Cool.
I'm Jordan. I just finished my MA in philosophy at Colorado State. It took me a few years to write the thesis, but I got it done. Lately, I've been working on some stuff on TikTok with on Metaethics, which is something that might come up in this conversation. Some free will stuff too, and that's kind of what I've been working on.
Cool, awesome. My name is Aaron Leitz. I'm your host, and I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I love studying philosophy in my spare time. So it's kind of the idea for this podcast is to continue that journey, and then also have you guys, the audience, join along. Whether you're in the beginning of your journey in studying philosophy, or if you're super good at it, you'll probably find something here. Okay.
You know what's really good too is that like you guys have some papers to go behind you, but I can still throw the they got 3 philosophers in a room and they can argue whether or not there's 3 philosophers in the room kind of thing. So I have that on my side at least, right?
That's right. I know, right? We're gonna go down that rabbit hole. I'm gonna say that I'm not a philosopher.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. Lastly, for the audience, if you like what you see here and what you hear here, please smash that like button and subscribe. Okay, cool. With that said, let's jump right in. Today's topic is what is goodness? This is definitely a hotly contested topic or debated topic in philosophy, in the history of Western philosophy, right? Even to today. And likely that debate is not going to end anytime soon. But some of our stuff we'll do today. This will be like a potentially multi-part series. We're just going to start by introducing you guys, the audience, to like the general conceptions of what philosophers talk about when they talk about what goodness is, the different ideas, the different usages of goodness, and then potentially field some of those ideas, questions, and go down some of those rabbit holes. So some of the first ones we talk about, or we start with, is the ideas of Aristotle, right? So Aristotelian ideas of goodness. I don't know if you guys wanted to say anything about this, but like generally speaking, Aristotle would say that like the goodness is like that which is morally right or just virtuous, right?
Well, at least on some accounts, Aristotle, on my understanding, and I'm not by no means an expert on Aristotle, has something like a functional understanding of goodness, right? And what I mean by that is, one of the examples that he uses is that a good knife is a knife that cuts well. Right. So it's a kind of what is sometimes known as a teleological understanding of goodness. There's a kind of goal-directedness.
Function or something, yeah.
Right. And that on his understanding, then, at least when it comes to human beings, what it is, so goodness is going to be a matter of what it is to be a good human being.
Yep. Or like that which is morally virtuous or something, right?
Right.
potentially begs the question as to what is virtuous. We won't go too far down that road, but want to give a little bit of a roadmap of like these different ideas and conceptions from philosophical history about what it means to be good. And perhaps starting out here, it's important to note for the viewer that many people use the word goodness, right, in a different ways, right? That's not to say that there isn't one right or one wrong, but the word goodness is oftentimes just used in different ways, different conceptions and stuff. And we'll go over pretty much all of them. So next one we have is utilitarianism, right? Jordan, what is utilitarianism or also consequentialism in terms of what goodness is?
So there's kind of the original conception by Jeremy Bentham, and he has a very simple idea of what that's going to entail, right? So it's just going to be a matter of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Now, later versions of utilitarianism are going to have, somewhat more sophisticated theories of what that's going to entail, what happiness is, but it's good to start with the basic: making people feel good, stopping them from feeling bad.
Yep. My notes here I have like that which maximizes happiness, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, right? And utilitarianism.
Yeah, I think like Sam, I don't like to really use Sam Harris as much. I don't hold like his views, but I think like he has that Bentham kind of approach in like the well-being concept. Is that I'm not trying to remember with the moral landscape if that's like kind of generally where he goes. I mean, I don't know if he mentions like Bentham. I think he has like a footnote about him in the book from what I remember, but so I don't know if that might help some people who might be more familiar with some popular work kind of bridge something there, but I don't know if you guys want to say anything about that.
Well, the well-being part, yeah, like the general conception that a lot of folks get in like philosophy courses is like utilitarianism, broadly speaking, has to do with the greatest good for the greatest number, or maybe the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Sorry, I'm trying to relate the like with the happiness or well-being kind of goal. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I mean, I think there's a kind of just intuitive sense in which, I think about something like planning a party, right? When you plan a party, you want to plan a good party, right? A good party, you're going to go, okay, well, what's going to be fun for people, right? What are people going to enjoy? They're going to want things to eat. That's pleasurable, right? Being hungry is, broadly speaking, painful. Having games is going to create pleasure, right? Because people can have fun, assuming they're fun games. If they're unfun games, if the only game you have is like tic-tac-toe, might not be so great.
I don't know, man. I love me some tic-tac-toe, though.
Super tic-tac-toe, but oh gee, man, that's. But boring. Being bored. Often people talk about being bored to tears, right? We think of being bored as a kind of pain, right? Mm-hmm. So just trying when you're thinking about your friends and the people who you're going to invite to your party, you're thinking about what makes them feel good and what's going to make them feel bad, and trying to arrange things based on that idea.
Yep. Next one we have on the list is deontology, right? So who wants to take this? What is it? What is the deontologist? And perhaps this goes back to Immanuel Kant, right? So what does the deontologist generally say what goodness is?
I mean, you're just it's gonna be like a rule-based kind of ethical framework. So you might have some rule in mind. Like I have friends that I don't want to get too in the weeds, but maybe they're like a threshold deontologist that they hold, like up until some threshold you hold some principle or something, or then you worry about the consequences of some action beyond this threshold or something like that. But generally, you're going to be focused on some kind of rule, right? Some kind of principle in mind that you follow by. I don't know if anyone wants to add that, but without trying to add a whole bunch to people at the beginning here, I want to try to leave it simple and short. I don't know if everyone would assent to that, but
yeah, because I mean, trying to get into Kant is
Yeah, that I wasn't gonna touch that. I was like, I'm not gonna touch the
Yeah.
Kant thing right
Yeah.
yet, but it is good to note, 100%. Yep.
Right.
But
So in my
I
notes,
think,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that, again, there's this kind of intuitive idea of like having like a code of honor, having, a set of rules that you treat people by, right? Don't murder them. Pretty straightforward there, right? And for most people, we don't always question why we might have the rules, or why we have this set of rules versus this set of rules, but that these are the rules that we follow, and that there's something good about those rules. To say any more is to get complicated, but
Yeah,
agreed.
the notes that I have here that I have down is just that according to a deontological idea about what goodness is it's an action that's in accordance with a duty or a moral law.
right.
Yep.
Right. Of course, to be distinguished from the other ones, such as Aristotelian and Utilitarianism.
And I mentioned the threshold kind of deontology as this kind of like, you just leaving open this kind of door of like, well, there are people that might have, this other kind of sub-view of deontology where, at some threshold, you might be concerned with something other than whatever the principle or the rule that you might be following, right? Hopefully I'm characterizing threshold deontologists right there, but but there's different little camps there you're not strictly like put into this camp of you have to follow this rule, because there are these other kind of views where upon some threshold you might be concerned with some other consideration.
Yep.
And I'm sure if you get it wrong, if any of them are listening to you, they'll let you
know.
they'll
let me know for sure. Yeah, I mean, that's why it's really good doing it in the way where you're introduce people to the concepts and stuff. It's a little you pretty much just have to get the concept wrong right away from the start if you're not adding too much. So hopefully we're hitting the nail on the head with just the basics.
10,000 foot perspective. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The next one is virtue ethics. Right. So we have traits, character that fulfill a human potential, right? A certain virtue of some kind. I don't know if you want to touch on that. I'm actually not super well versed in virtue ethics very much myself, but by you, Jordan, have you read some there?
It's a view that is in some ways a little bit
muddy
and maybe kind of alien to our contemporary context, right? I think I
don't mean muddy in a bad way, by the way.
Right.
Just to be clear.
But it can be kind of hard to pin down. But I think part of it is going back to that functional notion of good, right? Is that the virtues are, things like courage. We could add like honesty, these kinds of things, these kind of character traits or habits, right? That they are, when you have them as a person, those are what make you a good person, right? Like that make you a good person in the same way,
kind of characteristics or
right. And make you good in the same way a knife is good in sake of its sharpness.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. In the same way, like,
I wonder if that very much makes me think about Stoic philosophy, right?
Right.
You've got Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps, that's very much, it sounds like along those lines, right?
Right. I mean, they're virtue theorists, right?
Yep.
So
the good is that which aligns with these certain like virtues that are held in high regard, right?
Right.
Stuff like
that.
I
mean, it's good that we have I think we have teleological next, which like maybe like I don't throw everything on Jordan here, but we talk about like the knife and it's like cutting how that relates maybe to some teleological usage of goodness and its function and stuff like that. But I don't want to take Aaron's role on the next topic, so I don't want to introduce it. But I think like, it maybe people could get confused on this kind of like, well, okay, well then what distinguishes like this teleological understanding if we're talking about this function of this thing and its goal and stuff versus, the knife and the virtue ethics or Aristotelian kind of considerations or something like that.
Well, actually, yeah, I think one thing to start with that too, because yeah, the next one we have on the list is teleology, or the teleological conception of goodness. But perhaps, like, for those who don't know, like, that sounds like a weird word, right? What is
Mhm.
teleology at all?
Yeah, that's a. I don't know. You want me to take Jordan or you? Or?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, like if you want to, like a lot. I think the best way that I relate this to people is like if you're familiar with the kind of philosophy of religion or like the sphere of people, you're kind of you talk to your friends at the family member at the dinner table or something, Thanksgiving dinner table, and you have this religious conversation, and they find out maybe you're an agnostic or an atheist, and they say, well, look, I mean, I look at the world and it just seems like these things, look at how water functions for us, and everything seems to have this goal. It all seems to fit really well. And what they're pointing to in the world is that these things seemed in this way kind of that has this purpose, this function, right? It has this directedness towards this kind of specific aim, so to speak. And so maybe that's one way to kind of bridge somebody into this consideration about teleology is people might think that God exists and designs things for certain aims and purposes and functions and things like that. Jordan, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think probably it's worth pointing out, though, that not everybody who adopts like a teleological. So like
yeah.
So to maybe introduce some philosophical jargon, right? We can think of virtue ethics as a species of the genus teleological ethics, right? Virtue ethics is a species, right? And it's not for virtue ethicists. They're not necessarily, or teleological ethicists in general. They're not necessarily going to be like theists, right? They're not going to be necessarily be committed to like a literal designer, right?
Yeah, thank you for distinguishing that too. I don't want people to run away with the wrong idea.
So they might appeal to some. So like a more naturalist take would be something like, in virtue of like the kind of creature you are, right? Or maybe even appeal to some kind of understanding of evolution. This is going to be tricky, but
the function, maybe the function of the heart or something. Maybe we talk about. I'm trying to think of something we could maybe use as an example.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Yeah, right. And understanding, if you have heart disease, understanding what heart disease is understanding that like the way in which a heart is, in a sense, being a bad heart,
Yeah.
The way that it's malfunctioning, right? Now, figuring out how that works for a human being is it's not super straightforward, but yeah, that's going to be some people's view.
I think the other thing that comes to mind that you were mentioning there about like sort of this hierarchy is it makes sense to me to think about this like you have the teleology that has to do with purpose, right? Like, so let's say you're going along those lines and you're saying that which is good is sort of like meeting its goal to the purpose. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is just below that, of course, could sit our virtue ethics, because your goal in virtue ethics are these specific virtues and you're trying to hit those goals of those virtues, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's maybe a little more subtle than that, in the sense that in a sense that like your goal is to be a good person, and the way that you do that, the way that you manifest goodness, is by manifesting these characteristics,
courage or wisdom,
right.
Right.
That there's going to be this kind of I'm trying to think about how to put this in a plain English kind of way, that like we're identifying these things, that the goodness in a sense are the virtues. So maybe to kind of give a point of contrast, like I'm very sympathetic to what is sometimes called a consequentialist virtue ethics, right? So the idea there is going to be like something like this. So earlier we talked about utilitarianism. So instead of having, just trying to maximize the good at any, given action or choice, or having a set of rules, what you try to do is, well, I'm going to have these set of virtues, and as a result of those virtues, I'm on average going to maximize happiness, relative if I don't have those virtues, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Something like in the long run or something like that, right? And because that's going to be different, right, than what the kind of OG virtue ethics is going to be doing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Where the virtues are kind of like good in themselves, where with the kind of consequentialist version, it's like, well, no, they're good because they lead to these consequences.
I see.
So perhaps we're thinking about like that the contrast that you could say to yourself, okay, I think that if I'm just thinking about virtue ethics, let's say, the Stoics might say courage is in and of itself good. But
Yeah.
in this case, what you're talking about is like, well, I can think of a case where courage is actually not good, right? And might be like, right? So what you're saying is, let's put this onto the consequences, right? Broadly.
Right. Although, to be fair to the virtue ethicists, what I think they might say to reply to that would be something like, well, it's when you do something like that, when the courage leads to something that we'd otherwise consider bad, it's going because you're deficient in some other way, right?
Mm.
Yeah, you're courageous, but you're cruel, let's say, as opposed to kind of hitting that virtue of kindness or something.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, cool. Yeah, that gets us there. So the next one is a real rabbit hole. I don't want to go too deep into it, but we've got, if you've read G.E. Moore, and those who are watching this can look this up. He had, somewhat very controversial view, right, when he came out with this, I think, which was this idea that the good is just indefinable. It's a non-natural property, right, which is just known through intuition, right? So I don't even know if some would say it's non-propositional, right? But it certainly seems to say that he would say that the good is just non-definable, that you can't find it or define it, and it's just known through intuition, right?
So yeah, I don't know if we want to get into like the open question stuff, or if that might be like, a little too much.
That might be better to come back to after we maybe
Sure.
get a bigger, larger, zoomed out view of metaethics, because
which will be great, because it sucks. I want to talk about this because I want to go further once we get into more and talk about like a Kill Bill. Grommy has like this more Frege, more pincer argument where you kind of run through this Morian arm and this Phrygian kind of arm, and if it turns out like your natural, like your kind of notion of goodness or whatever is that's being used there can't reduce there's this open question, you end up with this like non-natural kind of the goodness. And so I think when we zoom out, like definitely I'm excited to talk about that, but I can't do that now, so I have to shut off. But yeah, Jordan, I want to definitely leave that to you and like where you want to go with the G more stuff and the open question, because it will get sticky quick, but it is worth trying to talk about in some sense, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, do you guys think that it would be better to maybe zoom out first and like work our way down, kind of give the general ideas of like what metaethics is, how it kind of relates to ethics, and
maybe you want to try to, like, I don't know, we could do it this way. We could ask if maybe you want to go over the open question and leave it there. I mean, I don't know how useful that might be, though. But I'll leave it to you. I don't know if I'm adding anything by adding.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably touch on that like once we finish this part of the list. But
Sure.
I think it's helpful to perhaps some people if you just like say, hey, like this is coming in the future. So we're sort of planting a flag. Hey, just like take a note. G.E. Moore had this other view of what goodness is or what goodness is about, right? So I see this as sort of the 10,000 foot perspective of all like touching briefly on all these different viewpoints of what goodness is.
You can be the one kid in the class if you're really interested and flip open the textbook and read ahead like nobody else does. They always stop at where the curriculum is. You could maybe if you're feeling froggy, you could just read ahead or something and do that. But yeah, Jordan, how are you feeling?
Well, I guess just my worry is that we're mixing up different levels of description, that we're working at different levels, different orders, right? Because so far we've been talking about, kind of the ethical notion of goodness, right? Like straightforward, like kind of action guiding, not
the metaethical,
as opposed kind of doing the metaphysics of goodness, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
And so I wonder if it's like might be useful to frame it like, well, so what do we, maybe like this. What have we been talking about so far, right? We're talking about goodness in a way that like, well, this is supposed to be kind of give you some idea of what you're supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. How you're supposed to treat other people, how you're supposed to kind of broadly behave in life, and maybe kind of go into what ethics is and like just getting a kind of soft handle on that, and then move up that next level and then start hitting different.
Well, I know before we started recording, you had kind of talked about this briefly in this distinction, and I don't know if maybe we could go there sometime soon or even now and build up to that, or however you want to take it. But
I mean, that's just my idea.
Yeah,
I'm flexible.
Yeah. I thought what you said at the beginning was pretty valuable on that. I don't know if it maybe is a good time to kind of mention that in the these distinctions, but yeah, however you want to proceed.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we can leave it there for GE Moore because we can come back to it. And I agree. I think sometimes it's just helpful to like be like, this is what we're gonna talk about, and then we talk about it, and then we say this is what we talked about.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So maybe it's worth just saying something to the effect of like, so far we've been talking about goodness and what it means in our lives and how that's going to like guide our behavior and how we are going to, it's going to affect what we choose in terms of how we live our lives. But then there's a different level that we'll be talking about later where we're not just talking about how we judge things, particular things to be good or particular actions, intentions, habits to be good, but what it would mean to be good and what it would mean for one of these ideas about goodness that we just discussed to be the right one.
Yep. And perhaps that's really helpful because that sort of drives at the real, I think, the root of the question, right, of what is goodness, right? That's really like, how do you define this and we'll get into like semantics and stuff like that, right?
Right.
Define terms.
Yep, I agree. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's see a couple more. So the next one is the infamous divine command theory, right? So Mike, tell us what that is.
So the goodness of something is going to be kind of made true by, I don't know if you want to say God's utterances, but the commands that he gives, right? So you can talk about, God commands that people don't engage in homosexual activity or something like that. Right? Someone could say, well, look, that's made true by this command. I don't know if we'll get into truth makers and all that kind of stuff. And maybe some views here don't like commit themselves in certain various ways. But the general idea is just going to be that these commands, right, are God is good and these commands are made good by what God says. So now we can get into the kind of Euthyphro issues, but I don't know if we want to get into that here, it might not be relevant at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful, right? Like, yeah, there is this thing for the viewers, there's this thing called the Euthyphro dilemma, which was, there's a famous piece of writing called Euthyphro from Plato. But in terms of this, for just divine command theory, Jordan, do you have anything to add as to what it is?
Well, I can't add too much yet, just because I think it might be a good idea to, at some point have a dedicated section 2 kind of broadly theistic views on these things, and theistic views on goodness, and kind of start breaking things down from there. And then I think at that point we could go deeper into what divine command theory is and what it entails. But I think we have to do, as some philosophers will say, some table setting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like you start it and you're like, well, it's easy just to give this kind of one sentence. And then you're like, what can I add to it? And it's like, well, the more I start to do that, the more we encroach on this level. So
yeah,
I think
I'm
we're good
definitely
here.
fully well aware of that as well. So I just wanted, just kind of touch like appetizer and then the main course, right? Of source, yeah. Okay, so in a roundabout way, of course, we have the other topics, like we've got theistic moral realism, right? And then divine nature theory, which is like sort of distinguished from divine command, right? Because broadly speaking, as you were saying, Mike, like this idea of divine command, the goodness is that which is commanded by God, right? Versus
and someone, like, if they're faced with this euthyphro, like, is it good because God commands it, or it's good and then therefore God looks to that, commands it, or whatever. Like a response, some people will say, well, it's like the goodness is grounded in God's nature, without getting into like whether or not these prop up the same kind of issues on a higher level or not at the objection kind of level. Someone might distinguish that the goodness is made true by God's nature, but not merely by like what he commands to be true or something like that. I think that would be the idea.
Right. And the theistic moral realism, of course, is just to say that goodness is, in some way, because of God's essence or will, right? So they're related, it seems, right? Cool. Now the last one is called care ethics. This, I think, found its home, or it kind of like sprung up years ago because in feminism and stuff like that, feminine philosophy, I think, right?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with this, actually.
Yeah, I'm not either. Jordan, are you familiar?
So one of the things that, and I'm not an expert here either, but my general understanding is that it kind of arises as a reaction to the way that philosophy has traditionally treated ethics, or at least has treated ethics in the past, 300 or 400 years, right? That it's universal, it's impartial, it's that the relationships that we have with one another aren't morally relevant, right? And it's kind of rejecting a lot of that. Not entirely, but it's putting constraints and it's modifying it. And different versions of care ethics are going to have kind of different relationships with this, right? Okay. And so the idea is that like our kind of responsibilities to each other partially come out of the relationships that we have with one another, right? And different people are going to kind of justify different things, but one point that some theorists make is that, like, look, your friends, your family, right? These are people you're close to, right? And because you care about them, because you're close to them, because you know them, right? There are going to be things that you can attend to that other people simply aren't going to be able to,
sure.
Right? And that part of what goodness is going to be is the way that you care for those people who are close to you. That's not to say that you don't have any kind of responsibilities. I mean, obviously, feminism is, broadly committed to the idea that you should work towards, this kind of equality among genders, equality among sexes, right? But that in, the kind of day-to-day practices that we do have special, responsibilities to the people close to us.
Mm. Yeah, which sort of just lends itself to this idea about this contextualness of relationships, right?
Right.
Yeah. I won't go down the road too far about subjectivity or something, but perhaps that's lending itself at saying, hey, like these like certain moral actions or goodnesses, if you will, are not this, it seems like definitely distinguished from deontology, because deontology might say, well, this one action is just wrong, right? Or whatever. Whereas in this way, care ethics might say, well, no, in certain contexts, right, of relationships, one
Right.
action might be considered wrong versus right in these two, scenario A or scenario B, right? Or
And
relationship A, right? B.
right. To make it obvious, there are you might kiss your partner, but it might be weird to kiss your friends. But
Yeah.
that's not even that's not going to be generalizable to some friends, because some friends kiss, and
Yeah. But the idea is this context sensitivity around the
Right.
relationships. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Cool. So, in broadly speaking, that's the sort of the map, right, of like these big ideas about goodness and stuff. Now, we could take this in many different ways, but I think some of the basic divisions that I have so far set out, maybe it might be a good idea, because we're roughly at the halfway point, but some of the basic divisions that we start talking about when we talk about goodness, right? Sort of, it feels like we have to first start looking at things like moral realism versus anti-realism, right? Like what those mean. But I didn't know if that was the road you wanted to go down first, or whether, Jordan, you thought another way to go to.
Well, I think it
elucidate.
might be worthwhile just to get a grasp on ethics, right?
Mhm.
So we've been talking about goodness, and goodness is kind of relationship to ethics. I think you can broadly understand it be it's that which you are, whatever your kind of understanding of what good is going to be the thing that kind of guides your behavior, right? And it's going to guide how you treat other people. And I think it's worth distinguishing ethics from some of the other things that, like, we might get confused with, right? So one example would be something like manners, right? That, at a fancy dinner, right, there's like a certain way that plates and the forks and the bowls are all supposed to be sat,
Mhm.
right, on the table, right? And to do something like eat your entree with the salad fork is
Bad manners.
it's bad manners.
Yeah.
It's a faux pas. You will be tutted.
I was thinking of that Family Guy episode when I think of faux pas. I need to describe this word. I call a professor. Use faux pas.
Yeah.
You know, or law, right? We've got laws. If you break a law, oftentimes if you get caught, you will be fined, you will be jailed, right? Or some other kind of punishment from your society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of what is going to make ethics distinct from those two things, right, is, at least the way I would put it, is that when you take on what you might call the ethical point of view, that's the point of view from which you're going to be judging those practices. So, like, for example, we think a lot of times that sometimes, laws can be wrong.
Yeah.
Right? That there's laws that we have that we should get rid of those laws, or
Let me smoke weed, man.
yeah, exactly. Or vice versa, that there's laws that aren't in place, that things that are legal that should be illegal, right?
I mean, look at the abortion,
Right.
kind of debate, obviously, right? There's just this side of aisle that think it's horribly wrong, and side that thinks preventing women from being able to do that is horribly wrong, right? So,
Right. And that's not going to be decided by its legality.
exactly. Yep. That's a great way to say it. Yep.
And
Certain laws
same
are
thing,
not good, is what you mean, right? Yeah, we're talking about. Yep.
right? And the same thing for manners, right? That we can think, who cares where I put my salad fork or whether I use my entree fork to eat my salad? Like, what does that matter?
Yeah.
And,
What did I do wrong?
Oh,
You can separate the
Yeah.
situation. Yeah.
like, does that, because I do something, does that, justify you screaming at me or something?
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
And,
Right.
you
Which
know,
is sort of the point of this episode, right? We're saying, what is goodness? And perhaps there's all these folks that disagree about goodness, and what does it mean for something to be good, right?
right.
Well, yeah, and like, so I actually I want to cut you off, Jordan, here, but I think that what permeates normative ethics, metaethics, and then this whole combination of things is this type of entanglement you see with using wrongness in some context where it's being interpreted in some metaethical way or some applied ethical way or whatever, right? Where you're just not interpreting how the person is saying the terms, and there's a clear distinction between how you use these terms because they have usages, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And ethics is also going to be distinct from something like mere personal preferences too, right? In the sense that you still have that kind of that ethical point of view where you can kind of criticize your personal preferences, even your own, like maybe for example you think that you shouldn't eat meat ethically, right? But you have this very strong preference to eat meat, and so you do it anyhow. You go, look, I shouldn't do this. I'm wrong for doing this, but I'm still doing it, right?
That's literally my view. I have that moral tension myself. So yep, that's where my philosophical anxieties lie. So exactly there, yeah.
Very very understandable. But also that where personal preferences can be a lot of times self-contained. Like if I like chocolate ice cream and you like vanilla ice cream, there's not really a conflict there. It's when we start involving other people, right? The ethics has this kind of other orientedness, right?
Would you say an expectation among beyond the subject, or I'm trying to think of maybe a way to word that.
Well, it's a way of does the way that I'm kind of interacting with the world, does that necessarily involve other people, right?
Sure.
Like how I react to what you do and how you react to what I do, and how do we resolve disagreements, and just broadly how human beings treat one another, right? And there's going to be some fuzziness there. There's going to be some edge cases, but that I would say again, to kind of use the abortion example, right? It's not merely that I prefer that, well, not I, but it's not merely that I prefer that abortion be legal, right? It's that I think that it ought to be, right, and that we that there's this kind of demand on, from my point of view, a demand on everybody to allow abortion.
Yeah,
sure. Well, the sort of the elephant in the room that I've thought about since the very, very beginning of just thinking about this episode is like how we define words, right? Mike and I in the past have talked about this idea about semantic realism, right? And that seems to be like an underlying current in society where folks will either like explicitly or implicitly think to themselves that like words just have absolute meanings. Whereas in philosophy, what we quickly seem to find out is that oftentimes they don't. And specifically, like with a word like goodness, right? It tends to be this thing where no, like what we actually discover in the world is that people use a word like good in many different ways, and it seems, at least to me, it seems very difficult to parse this out and say, well, this is the necessary and sufficient conditions, right? We draw a box around this is what's good, everything else is not, right? In other words, like goodness just has this definition, here's the box, and then everybody else is wrong. That seems to be itself an incorrect picture of what goodness is, because of the fact that like human language is not like this rigid thing. It seems to be more fluid, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you surveyed a bunch of people on some ethical questions without being kind of specific on the domain, so you might ask somebody some question like, is it wrong to steal from your brother? And they're like, yeah, right. And then you get to this one question of like, is it wrong to torture this baby for fun? And they might feel pressured in one way, and now they're viewing the question as a not. They went into it thinking they were doing this normative ethical thing, and what I mean there is like, maybe there's some utilitarian, or they have some view we talked about earlier, and they're answering it kind of based on how their normative theory or their ethical theory kind of instructs them on, well, yeah, I should think this is wrong or whatever, right? But then they get to this one question and then they answer it metaethically. Like they kind of switch up and they're like, well, no, I don't think it's wrong, because I don't think that there's what we'll talk about later, stance independent wrongness. I don't think that we can use the kind of layman speak here, which I know Jordan wants to go over, the objective. There's no objective wrong. And they might feel pressured and go, well, crap, I don't want to look like a giant monster. I'm just kind of reporting my metaethical views. So yeah, there's something wrong here or something. And, if depending on how the question is asked or how the person feels with the social pressure, they might answer it in one way that isn't how the question was intended, or you can kind of play with the usages there, right? And I see this happen a lot in the kind of moral philosophy landscape, where you could ask somebody using the same word if they think it's wrong, but if you don't specify, are we talking about the metaphysics of kind of goodness here or my theory, then you could answer it different ways. And so there's a worry there with the kind of semantic realism or whatever, because clearly there's usages here that fit different domains, right?
Really quick before you jump in, Jordan, I think one thing that I want to bring to light is perhaps a couple of terms that you brought up, right, that a lot of people might not know. So that's normative, right, and metaethics, right? So really quick, well, maybe you could do this, Jordan. Just broadly speaking for the audience, what is the difference between normative ethics and metaethics?
Right. So in the same way, when we were talking about, these things being, these ideas about goodness being kind of action guiding, about how we're going to, how it's going to affect my choices in my life, right? And how I judge certain things. That's going to be a matter of normative ethics, right? Normative ethics is trying to determine, well, what should I do with my, what should I choose? How should I live my life? How should I treat other people, right? And then metaethics is going to ask some different questions, right? So one way to think about it is metaethics is asking at least 3 different questions, right? One of which is, when we use moral language, when we say things like good, right, wrong, what are we doing? Like how do we understand that language and what it's doing, right? Mm-hmm. And another question is, okay, what is the relationship between ethics and the world more broadly, right? Like how does, goodness right, in this kind of action guidance sense, show up in the world? Like,
Yeah. Does
like,
it have an essence, or does it imbue itself in natural kinds, or what? Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And then finally, you know, how do we find out things about what's good, right? How do we figure out, for example, you know, we go through all these different, you know, ideas about what good is. Well, you know, how do I find out which one should I believe in, right? Which one should I adopt, right? Um,
So it sounds like we have like you could potentially ask at least two different questions about goodness. You could ask goodness in a normative sense, and you could ask goodness about in a metaethical sense, right?
yeah, I mean, we're thinking about things in it's a little complicated, but
Yeah.
the way I would put it is there's an action guiding sense and a to use a technical word, the kind of the metaphysics, semantics, and epistemology, right? Like, what is goodness, and how do we relate to it? Like, what is the kind of description of what goodness is? Um, the reason I say, because normativity, you know, on some people's accounts, ends up sneaking back in, right, to metaethical questions, because then there's ways in which there might be normative considerations at the level of metaethics, but we that's probably something that we can safely ignore for the time being.
For now. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like the one way to, I think maybe I can get a scent from you guys, just in case someone's hears this word normative and kind of just thrown off, because I know I was at first, but we're talking about, you know, what we should do or shouldn't do, or it's really like this reason based kind of talk. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that or correct anything there, but just to try to give a little plain way to do it, which is really hard. It's really hard to do, but
yeah, it is. Is we can think of it like, right? I think a kind of folksy way of thinking about it is like, you know, there's the way the world should be, and there's the way the world is, right? You know, and so, you know, there's, and normativity can show up in these kind of very like thin ways, like this kind of like, you know, I know one of the things we want to talk about is kind of this like chess analogy, right? There are good moves in chess, right? That, like, given that you're playing chess and given that you're trying to win, this is there's the move that you make, and then there's the move you should make, right? And, you know, given a certain,
or better, so like the description is you made this move, you shouldn't have made that move.
Right.
So that's the normativity, but we would say then the parity to the metaethical would be like the question of like, what is playing chess?
Yeah.
That'd be the parity?
What does it
mean to
play chess, and
exactly
what is chess relationship with the world, and
okay.
And
I like that.
you might leak into the do the on the metaethical considerations, and then maybe this is where Jordan's thinking that some things might sneak back in, so I'll try to be careful, but like you know, do they depend on someone's attitude or opinion or desire, or are they the kind of things that don't, right, when you're looking at it from the relation to the world and stuff like that. And so that gets us into like the stance dependence and independent stuff, which I'm not sure if we'll touch on this one, but yeah,
I think that's a good one. Like, right. So I think for this episode, I like this idea of the 10,000 foot view. So maybe you can do that for us, Mike. Like, so broadly speaking, like what is the difference between like a stance dependent view on goodness or morality and a stance independent view on morality or goodness?
Sure. I think there's something we should do before we do that, and that is this idea of stance dependence. And I'm actually curious on. I'll be saying this a lot to get your guys' opinions on this, just to make sure before I go on that I'm not saying something wild, but this idea of stance independence or dependence, just out of the framework of moral philosophy for a second, like what it means for like a shoe to exist stance independently, or this tree, right? As opposed to like it being dependent on my opinions. And so I think that might help kind of not mix two things together right away. So like, imagine I just kind of came up to you, or someone came up to me and said like, hey, it's, you see that beautiful tree over there? And I just plug my fingers in my ears and close my eyes, and I'm like, I don't see the tree, blah, 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 blah. And they're just sitting there like, bro, it doesn't really matter if you do that. The tree exists independent of, your opinion or your attitude or your, wanting to just sit there and deny it. It still exists, and so that tree exists in kind of lay speak, or, how a lot of people would generally say this. It exists objectively, right? Now, I think Jordan and I both have weird kind of things with using those terms. So I'm kind of do that to relate them. But philosophers like to use this idea of stance independence, and some people maybe might be familiar with mind independence, but there's some issues there too, related to some people's views that might depend on the mind. So we have to be really careful, right, about what we mean here. And the stance independence, relating in the same way with the tree, is like, well, look, there are these moral facts, right? There are these propositions. And by what I mean there is there are these statements, and they can be true or false. And they concern themselves about, like, whether or not something should be done, independent of what you think. You might think you shouldn't do this, right? But in fact, you should, independent of what you think. No different than, look, if you have good reason to think that there's a tree in front of you, you're just for whatever reason denying it, you just don't care to see the tree. Well, you should believe the tree. I mean, once you're kind of informed on all this stuff, you would agree that there's this tree stance independently. And so someone who's a moral realist might insist that, look, I mean, maybe it's not clear to you now, but these moral facts exist. And once I can kind of get you to see that, you're going to understand they're not dependent or made true by things that you think, but they could be conflicted with what you think, but nonetheless, they're true. So I don't know if maybe anyone wants to add anything to that, or.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth, saying a little bit about why stance independence and stance dependence as opposed to mind independence, right?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Because I feel bad for my realist friends that are like phenomenal, like they held their roots in like phenomenology, and I'm like, well, they just seem kind of screwed here. Right. They're just subjectivists, or they're just anti-realists no matter what, apparently.
Right.
So, yeah.
So one issue is just that, like, I mean, we can consider other, mind-dependent phenomenon, right? So, like, take psychology or sociology, right? Insofar as those two disciplines, right, are capable of doing something like having what I would call scientific generalizations, right? So not necessarily as uniform as strong as something like a law of physics, but that you can say, look, generally speaking, a person, I think a good example is if you take a picture, if you have like eyes in a room, right, and you have like a bowl of candy, and what you'll notice that versus a room that doesn't have any eyes, if the rule says take one, people, broadly speaking, will only take one more often in the room with the eyes as opposed to the room without eyes, right? Yeah. So insofar as you can make these kind of scientific generalizations, we don't want to say, well, those aren't real generalizations. Those are like fake or like lesser generalizations somehow, just because obviously if there were no minds, right, you couldn't make those kinds of generalizations, right?
Yeah.
Or, you know, we don't think that, like, look, we think that there's something like biological facts, right? There's certain ways that you know, there's generalizations you can make about evolution. There's generalizations about, you know, how chemistry works in organisms, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But we don't want to go, well, they're somehow lesser facts because in a world without life, there would be no biological facts,
Yep.
right? And so for the same reason, we go, look, just because there are minds and that these facts might depend on mind in general, it's not going to depend on a particular mind or a particular set of minds, right? That it's going to apply to at least all the minds of, like, let's say, of a certain type, right?
Yep.
So maybe like all minds that are intelligent and social, like all intelligent social minds or something.
Meet some threshold or something like that of
Yeah, that
Yeah.
you have, like, of the minds that have this property, right? You know, just to stay away from questions about, well, do animals have minds? And, you know,
Well, we could have done the whole, what about the Ring camera and a Halloween? When kids take it, there's no eyes. There's the Ring.
Yeah.
We can do the philosophy game all day. So, yeah, no worries.
So the piece of this, I think, it just helps. I think, you know, just make sure I'm on the right path here. Is that so? We have this idea about a certain position about morality or goodness being stance independent would just mean that there's this truth about the world, broadly speaking, the world, the universe, the cosmos, whatever you want to call it, right? That is not dependent upon any person's opinion or definition. It's
or
just
society.
true. Yeah, it would be true. Like, it would be true similar to how, like, a rock is true. Like, whether all minds exist or not in the universe or something, there's still this rock there. So if a moral position or a position on goodness is stance independently true, then it seems correct to say that it would be true regardless of whether or not there's human beings around. Would that be broadly correct?
Not necessarily, right? And this is kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that it might depend on there being human beings.
Yeah. Yep.
But it's not going to depend on, like, my thoughts, you know, my beliefs, my desires, my wishes, etc. And it's not going to depend on even something like my society, right? It's going to be something like, as long as there are humans around of any kind of human, any particular human, right? These are going to apply to something like all humans, or maybe even something like all sapient beings, right? So that, you know, it wouldn't just apply to human beings, but, you know, some kind of AI or aliens or something, right?
Good.
Maybe I don't know if this is a great example. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but like maybe you want to say, like, look, if there's just this world of, you know, I don't want to say nothing, but really there's no structure and it's just this empty void, right? Like we could say something like it's necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4 in these worlds where there's, you know, maybe mathematical applications or something, but like in this world where, like, this devoid world or something, like maybe that's not the case or something, but like something similar like that. I don't know if that's a great example, but it's like, you know, it doesn't change the fact that it's true independent of humans, but there needs to be the humans. Otherwise, like, it's, you know, like your biology case, like, well, trivially, there aren't going to be these facts about life if there's no biology, right? But that doesn't all of a sudden make my my realism like not realism or something like that. Yeah. And then like another concern is whether or not, like, me from a different angle, you know, if you're like my buddy Cease, he's a moral realist, so he thinks, and he, you know, he accepts that they're stance independent moral truths, but he thinks that a lot of this has to do with the nature of the mind, and it roots in phenomenological considerations, right? This first person kind of experience and what it's like to experience. And it seems like it would be very unfair for me as an anti-realist to tell him, well, your view is anti-realism because it's mind dependent, right? It's dependent on whether or not these minds exist and that phenomenology, you know, could even be a thing. But that doesn't seem like a very fair criticism if what's true is true about the nature of the mind, that is still independent of stances that I take, right, or opinions that I take. And so that might be another way to look at that. Jordan, what do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I think it's worse than being unfair. I think it's boring.
Yeah,
Right.
it's actually just like foot stomping for anti-realism at that point.
Right. Well, and it just makes the debate less interesting.
Yeah, sure.
I'll give you guys a little secret about philosophers. A lot of the way that we set things up because the distinctions make for interesting dialogue, right? That we have something to discuss, right? And that we're trying to, carve things up in a way that there's some kind of something stands and falls on these things, right? And that's kind of like what we're trying to get at, right? So
there's things that turn, right?
Right.
Beliefs may turn on these specific questions. Yeah. So again, we've got this notion about if a position about goodness or morality is independent of stance, then it just means it doesn't depend upon individual person's position on it, right?
Well, or any group,
or any group's position.
Any you could kind of it's always going to apply to some broad category, right? Whether that be, again, something like human beings or sapient creatures,
sure,
or
something else. So then that, of course, makes it perhaps easy to elucidate the opposite, which is stance dependent, right? Which says, okay, the truth or falsity of this specific idea about goodness or morality or something that's moral just pertains to, right, is attached to like a truck with a hitch, with a tow hitch or something. It's attached to this person or this group's view upon what goodness or morality is, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. The attitude, one's attitudes or group's attitudes, more generally, right? So not only what I believe, but it could also include things like what I desire, what I'm committed to in some kind of in some way that's kind of distinct from something like desire or what I believe in. So there's kind of a whole range of kind of mental entities that you might think. Yeah. It depends on these, mental states or mental entities, and it might. Your theory might say, well, it depends on the individual, or it might depend on a group, right? Or
it might depend on God or something.
Or it might depend on God.
I don't want to throw a wrench in here, but there's also there's just to kind of show how weird this can also kind of get without throwing a bunch of terms at people. But I have to maybe throw one term because you're bringing up these kind of these mental entities. And so I know me and Jordan have briefly talked about intentional states and kind of folk kind of understanding of beliefs. And so when we're saying intentional states, we're talking about things like beliefs and desires, hopes, dreams, right? These kind of things. That there's, if you're someone who considers themselves, and this is the word I hopefully will not regret introducing, but an eliminativist. So someone that's well, I don't really think that there are these folk beliefs and desires and stuff. Kind of curious on what you guys think here, but if they deny that there are stances to begin with, but nonetheless there's moral facts, right? There's going to be this type of stance independent realism going on, but I throw this in there just to kind of show how the kind of variation that you can kind of conjure up here and get into. And I don't know if maybe we should do that, but just kind of throwing out how there's a lot of ways to slice the independence and the mental states and all this kind of stuff where you have a big platter to eat from, so.
Right.
Yeah. Well, actually, I like that. Actually, I like introducing this stuff. So, what would be a pretty intuitive way to understand, like again for the non-philosophy major and stuff, understand this notion of eliminativism.
Yeah, it's a weird word.
Eliminativism.
Eliminativism.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, there's philosophers like Alex Rosenberg who are pretty well known, like eliminativists and stuff. I mean, and like there's eliminativism of different stripes, so it's kind of like being, I would say, like related to like if I'm a nihilist. It's kind of, I don't really like to say those kind of things. I like to be more like, well, maybe you're a moral nihilist or moral anti-realist or mereological, right? All these terms we don't have to worry about now. Essentially, the idea is there's these kind of camps that you can apply this term to, and someone that's an eliminativist in this case, what we're talking about is that they don't think that, at least I think in like Alex Rosenberg's case, to use an example, something like intentional states like beliefs and desires, someone might take these as being like normative, like we talked about earlier. They relate themselves with reason talk and what we should do, and they're not like merely these causal entities like glass dropping and shattering. There's something like distinct about these beliefs. They guide our reason. It's like an electron. It's not like if an electron goes some way, it should have gone the other way, right? What the eliminativist is like doing is kind of like eliminating this kind of normative talk there in this case. They're saying, and these are intentional kind of entities, and saying, well, no, look, we could have a better science. We'd really understand at the level of the brain what's going on. And so this like folk labels of beliefs, desires, and being related to reasons and normativity is really confused. So these kind of stances just don't really exist. But nonetheless, there are moral facts, and they're independent of like, what we would think humans are saying, or, the beliefs that they might have, however we talk about that. There's still these facts that are true. They're cognitive. They're not just like, some gibberish kind of nonsense. They're real, truth valued kind of statements. And so that might be one take of somebody taking this type of realism, but they also could just deny that there are stances in general, right? And it's a weird view. I don't know. It's not a view I take, but I'm just throwing this out there to kind of maybe at the end of this kind of throw like, something your guys' way to see if you guys think that's total nonsense or how you'd respond to that.
It's super tricky, right? Yeah. Because they have to be very careful to explain things in a way that then don't accidentally sneak back
the stances in. That's been my problem of understanding this view,
right?
Yeah,
and making sense of that. It might be worth saying part of their motivation too is like another couple of the eliminativists were the Churchlands. I think I don't remember if both of them are still alive. I think Patricia Churchland is still alive. They were kind of a philosophy, cognitive science power couple, but part of it is that they think we don't have to talk.
They didn't really believe that they loved each other. Yeah. sorry, I had to do it.
They just thought we could reduce all this belief talk to brain state talk or something, right?
Yeah. That's a good way to. That's a really good way to phrase it. Yeah.
But then the question is like, well, trying to understand, well, what's happening when you're saying these things, when you're making these claims. If you're not expressing something like a belief,
mm-hmm.
and how do we understand things like justification and so it's really hard. And an eliminativist could go kind of either way, right? They could say, they could kind of like just reduce things to like, look, we just have these kind of, biological impulses, and we're designed in such a way to be social, right? Or they could say, look, there's this moral talk is, somehow it's saying something about, optimization or something apart from any particular set of affairs or something. But either way, it's gonna be really tricky for them. But I also wouldn't discount it as impossible or something.
Yeah. I don't know that any of the three of us are in the camp there, but I'm actually really excited, and we'll give a little sneak peek there then for when we get into full of mind stuff at some
Right.
point. Yeah. So
Yeah, well, and actually, so I haven't done a lot of reading myself in terms of this perspective on eliminativism, but so just to recap it, like in terms of this, like broadly speaking, the general position of this thing, what is it precisely that we're eliminating or that they are eliminating?
oh yeah. In this case, it's like this kind of I don't know, maybe Jordan would be better at this, but like, so I think I misspoke and said this norm because they might still think that the stance independent moral facts are like normative facts, but and that relate to like what you should do. But then that's where it gets kind of weird for me is like, well, I don't really know how to talk about beliefs and reason and all these kind of stuff and what I should do and stuff like that, that how it relates to me if I'm an eliminativist. But they seem to be just eliminating this psych folk talk about beliefs and desires. I don't really know how to like go further into that. That there aren't these kind of mental entities, or like they're just gonna kind of insist that once we understand the brain at a better level, that what's going on there is a very semantically complex statement that's just easier to use this fiction of belief talk, right? That might be something they say.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So like an example I like to use with the view that I do hold is that I don't think that there's this special metaphysical property of truth, right? I just don't hold that view. I'm maybe like some type of, well, I don't want to use words here and get into deflationism and stuff like that, but I don't think that there's this grand, metaphysical, like my kind of theory on this is, or my view on this is like, well, there's this useful notion of the truth predicate, that if we imagine a world where like, so there's this world and Jordan just always reports true facts. They're not made true because Jordan says them, right? But he happens to look at the world and every time everything Jordan says is a true proposition, right? He gets it right every time. Now, you imagine the same world where you don't have that truth predicate. So I can't talk about, well, everything that Jordan says is true. I can't do that anymore. So what do I have to do? Well, if I wanted to like quantify over these statements, I'd have to give this endless conjunctive list of like, well, Jordan thinks grass is green. He thinks, the sky is blue and pizza tastes good and all this kind of stuff. What I think's really going on is that there's not, you don't have to be committed to this like metaphysical theory of truth, but you can, instead of having this really complex semantic statement, right, where you just, if you understood what was going on with the world to this high degree, even if you did, you wouldn't really want to talk in such a way because you'd never get done with your sentence. You'd never be able to quantify over all the things that Jordan says. So you have this really useful predicate, truth. And so now I can quantify over all of those things in just one simple sentence. And I think the Eliminativist is making a similar move. I don't want to say it's the same move, but it's a move where if you understood at the level of the brain what was going on, we obviously still wouldn't opt for talking about axons and neurons and stuff like that, but rather we would just still say belief. Right.
And maybe Jordan, you can tell me if you think this is right. Cause like I come from this, I actually still consider myself a layman when it comes to philosophy. So, right. Like it seems like what may be happening like in a layman's terms is that like we're saying what it appears as though is happening if somebody says this action is good, right, is actually not what's going on. And so what they're trying to do is eliminate that. Is that roughly right?
So they're going to be eliminating beliefs, any kind of belief, not just beliefs about,
goodness,
moral facts or about goodness, but, when you believe that, your car is white, right?
Yeah.
And that, you have this kind of idea of like, well, what I'm doing is I have like this kind of picture in my head, and there's going to be some kind of relationship between that picture that belief kind of contains, or sorry, holds, and there's going to be some kind of like relationship there that like that matches. What they're going to say is, no, that's not what's happening. So what it is that you have this your brain is in the state such that what it does is it guides your body in such a way that, like, when you're, out in the parking lot and you're looking for a car, when the that particular wavelength of light hits your eyes, your certain things activate in your brain such that you pay closer attention to it, and then you're like looking for different markers or things to say that's your car, right? And that it's a little tricky, because even there, right, like where I gave that description, it's like I there's this way in which we still kind of smuggle in.
Yeah, it's hard to actually try to eliminate it, is what ends up happening.
Yeah.
It doesn't negate their like thesis to like point this back to them, but it's like, but again, it's how are we talking about this and understanding your view when you depend, it's so intimately wedded to the thing you're trying to get rid of,
Right.
It's a really weird kind of phenomena.
Interesting. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's super cool. I think, there's definitely that rabbit hole would go super far, right? And,
yeah. I mean, one way to look at it's not the right way, but it's like the thing going on in your brain and like the things it produces, and accepting this kind of like distinction between like there is this thing, the belief that emerges. I don't like to use these words because it commits people to things they might not want to commit to, but just general speak here, right? Not committing to any thesis here, but like, these axons, neurons, and the things going in produce these like real beliefs, these real intentional states. They might be committed. Like, I don't deny there's not a brain, right? Like there's a brain and they produce these beliefs, and the eliminativist is like, well, that's just confused, right? They're like, that's what's going on. You don't need this kind of additional, thing there that it produces, the belief or something. And that might not be the best way to think about it, but maybe getting rid of the philosopho speak, that's one way to kind of visualize this distinction where the person's kind of eliminating this thing that's being produced by the brain, right? That's just like illusory, right?
A belief. Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, okay. So maybe perhaps this might bring it to sort of open the next door, right? Which has to do with this distinction that oftentimes we talk about in metaethics, right? Which is cognitivism versus non-cognitivism, right? And now, of course, for those listening, well, the way that I think about this is that non-cognitivism is just this notion that moral statements are not really connected to the world in a way that we think that they are. They're really just more of us like expressing an emotion of some kind, right? So if I say that, helping the poor is good, it's kind of more so like me just saying, well, not even saying, but like expressing an emotion that says, yeah, right? Would that be roughly right? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so that's going to be specifically
a type of non-cognitivism,
yeah, emotivism specifically, right? And that's going to be kind of the earliest version, right? Specifically AJ Ayer, if it's something you're interested in. And the idea is so there's some kind of like simple, like what we might call in philosophy a pro attitude, right? That you have like a pro attitude towards like helping old ladies across the street. You're like, yay, helping old ladies across the street. But so Ayer's version is kind of not super sophisticated, but another guy, Stevenson, he says, it's not just that you're having this kind of attitude towards helping old ladies across the street. It's that you are saying yay to you saying yay, right? Is this kind of like I'm trying to get you to join me in endorsing this, right? Which might be distinct from something like I might just be have the same kind of a similar pro attitude for like I love chocolate ice cream, right? But I'm not not necessarily trying to get you to love chocolate ice cream, but we're engaged in moral language. I am, but the kind of options of what you're doing, right? When you're doing this kind of expressing, it can be things like another example is hair, RM hair, I think it is. He thinks that what you're doing is something like giving commands, like help old ladies, you over there, help the old ladies.
Which
If you see
isn't, which wouldn't be like saying shut the door wouldn't be a proposition. So it's
right, exactly.
Yeah. So the idea is like you have a cognitivism, which is this idea that like these moral statements express propositions, right?
Right.
And so propositions are things that, you know, can bear truth or falsity. And so another word to express this is that they're bivalent. So they can, you know, they can be true or they can be false. And
Right.
If you have some view where you say like, you know, I really enjoy playing guitar, you know, that's something that somebody in the cognitivist sense can be expressing like it's a truth apt statement, right? It expresses a proposition. Right. But then the non-cognitivist, in the case of the emotivist or someone here, might be just they could be saying something like "Yay, guitar," you know,
yeah,
and they could even be saying like "Yay, you know, you should be playing guitar." And in this command sense, there's a similar kind of thing where it's not it doesn't express a proposition, because if I just told Jordan, "Hey, go shut the door,"
right,
and then we analyze this further, like, "Hey, is Mike, go shut the door. Is that true or false?" Well, that sounds kind of weird. It's like, is telling me to sit in a chair true or false? Well, no, it doesn't. You know, you could say like it's true that Jordan told Mike to sit in the chair, but then even then, the non-cognitivist is, you know, not going to be accepting that. So there's this distinction to be made about the, you know, propositional state, and I think this is a good example because commanding something, I think a lot of people in general are going to agree, isn't expressing some type of proposition, right?
Right.
So then maybe the way that this sort of relates to goodness, would it be like accurate to say that somebody who's a non-cognitivist, as you just said, Mike, like, of course, like the view there, of course, is that moral statements can't be true or false, right? Either one. But then when it comes to like defining terms, like something that's like, I might say, you know, helping the poor is good. Are we also saying like, in that case, like that statement itself can't be true or false? It's more of like an expression of me saying this. Right?
They're at all costs, they're going to be, you know, denying that. Now, I don't know how they answer the question, is non-cognitivism true? So I don't really, you know, maybe that's just me being cheeky. I don't know. You know, I don't know if it's important. Maybe because I'm like failing to remember. There's like two main kind of camps here of this non-cognitivism. There's emotivism, and then what am I missing here, Jordan? You can help me.
Well, there's
I know there's a lot, but there's like two main ones I thought we could go over: Eliminativism and emotivism, and something else. But I thought the other one I'm thinking of is kind of outdated anyway. So
the only thing I can think of is, so a lot of these things they're not like, at least on my understanding, they're not camps in the sense of, you know, opposing each other.
I see. Yeah, that's a good way to.
But like, there's so there are expressivists of who emotivists are going to be.
That's what I'm thinking of. Yes,
are going to be a type, and then there's going to be some known as quasi-realists. And what quasi-realists try to do is give an account of this expressing that we do in such a way that we earn back the ability to say, and this is a little confusing, that earns back the ability to say that they're true or false. But it's gonna be true or false in a non-literal sense.
Okay.
And that's maybe kind of where some people are you can kind of think of it as different camps, as whether we need to, you know, kind of earn back this kind of cognitive sounding language, even though that's not, literally speaking, that's not what's happening.
So now let's distinguish, like we'll sort of open the box, right? It just seems fitting that we have this idea of non-cognitivism, where moral statements, moral propositions, if you will, they can neither be true nor false, with the idea of what is commonly called error theory, or previously what was called nihilism, right? Friedrich Nietzsche and so forth, right?
Yeah,
Somewhat and so forth.
that's what I used to be.
Okay. So, but broadly speaking, right, it seems as though, so we've got this idea that in non-cognitivism, moral statements can neither be true nor false. In error theory, moral statements can potentially be true or false, but we're just saying that they're all false, right?
Yeah, and actually, this is like important because I've had people message me in the past being like, "How is error theory not a form of non-cognitivism?" Right? They get kind of confused by that. But I mean,
Right.
once you kind of pay attention, it's pretty obvious. It's really easy if you're kind of getting into this to get confused because you're looking at like these negations and everything's false and non-cognitism. So your brain does these kind of weird things when you associate certain terms. But yeah, like error theorism is a type of cognitivism, and again, that just means that what they're agreeing to is that these moral statements express propositions that could be true or false. They just, in the case of the error theorists, they just happen to always be false, right? They just happen to always be false. And I was an error theorist actually for a while, but someone had pointed out to me that since it's not clear to me whether or not stance independent moral facts is propositional in my own view, that it's hard for me to like state that all these views or all the propositions would be false because there's still this kind of open question on what I think. So I haven't really committed myself on that view, but someone that, at least when I did hold the view, yeah, I just thought that all moral statements, all these stance independent moral statements were false. I don't know if maybe we should go into that, whether or not this matters on the stance independence or dependence kind of. I know some people have talked about like conditional error theory, which I'm not sure if that's like a real kind of domain, but I guess they're just saying like, look, if what you're telling me is that there's stance independent moral truths, those are all false, but I might subscribe to like some view where I think, that I should do things and that that's true or something like that.
Well, one question that comes to mind is sort of, just sort of with the topic that we're thinking about in terms of goodness is, if it's the case, let's say if it's the case that error theory is correct and all moral statements can be either true or false, but they're all false. How does this connect to the idea that like we're wanting to attempt to define what is a morally good action? Would that mean there really is no such thing as a morally good action or a bad action? Or how does that connect?
Yeah, this is, I believe, in literature known as the now what problem.
Yeah,
Right. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So once you're committed to this, like, what do you do there? What some people try to do is they try to build a account of where we have this kind of practical interest in maintaining some notion of morality, but that it's going to be reducible to like what us as individuals have interest in. That given that most people have like, most of us want to be safe, most of us we have this kind of practical interest in setting things up in such a way that like we are safe or we do have food or right.
Yeah. Go with that.
Yeah, that's helpful. The other question I have that I've often thought about, and I don't know that I have an answer, but I'm really interested to bounce this off you is, now we distinguish these two ideas from this idea about moral realism that we spoke about earlier. And I have thought to myself for some time, the question, what would it even mean for a moral action to be good, independent of stance, or like, right, like trying to not bring up the objective word, but right, like, so if it was actually really good aside from any group or any individual's stance or position? Well, I mean, does it even make sense to ask that question?
So I think that, I just kind of have this general kind of methodology in that if a lot of smart people hold a position, I kind of approach it like, look, either if I don't understand it, then maybe there's something, there's something wrong with me, right? There's some kind of failure on my part. But I think the best characterization, right, is to, there's a bunch of different kind of accounts here, but to kind of give, an intuitive sense of how this might work, right, or to kind of see the motivation, is that one way of characterizing, reasons as being something like normative reasons versus something like psychological reasons, right? Where psychological reasons are going to be, or your subjective reasons are going to amount to motivations, right? What motivations you have, in fact, right? So one case that I believe Parfit kind of gives is, if I'm, like I've got a really bad headache, right? And I find some pills that I think are aspirin, right? They look like aspirin that I've had before, but actually it's, cyanide, right? But I don't know that. On a subjective account of reasons, I can't be motivated, right, to not take the aspirin because I don't know, like I don't have the information that it's actually, cyanide, right? So what someone who's in favor of, stance independent reasons go, look, you do have a reason not to take those pills because even though you don't have a motivation, right? The reason being those are cyanide. You want to live, right? And yeah, that's going to connect, right, to your stances, right? But it also connects to an objective fact, which is these are cyanide and they will, you'll die, right, if you take them. And so it's supposed to be this kind of relationship that the reason connects your stances to the world, right? And it's it's like for anybody who wants to live, you have a reason not to take those cyanide pills, regardless of whether you have a motivation to not take those pills, right?
Which would still entail that this is still dependent upon stance, right? So I think perhaps no, is it not dependent on stance?
Not
I guess.
not on, because Parfit's thing is that it can't be dependent on your stance because you don't have the stance, right? Because you do not, because stances in this, reasons in this on this, a subjective reason is going to amount to a motivation. But because you don't have the information about the pills, you can't have the motivation, right?
It's kind of similar to what I said earlier about the like eliminativism thing, except in this case, it's not like you're limiting the beliefs, but you just happen not to have that particular belief. Is that the idea, Jordan?
Right. And because you don't have that belief, you can't have the motivation. And because you don't have the motivation, you don't have the subjective reason to not take the cyanide pills. You do have a stance independent reason because...
Is that epistemic? The reason?
It's going to be practical. That this is going to be a account of practical stance independent reasons, right? And so the idea is not that he's giving you a moral, stance independent, but he's giving you a practical one, saying like, look, this is a very intuitive case of a practical stance independent reason. And if you think that there can be these kind of practical stance independent reasons, right, then there's no reason in principle why this couldn't be extended to moral, right? One example might be something like, maybe your friend is in pain, right? But because they're kind of like one of those macho dudes, they have this like very straight stoic face about it, and they just, ignore it. If you knew, right, you would help them, but because you don't know, you don't have the motivation, and so we can't say that you have a subjective reason to help him, but you do have a moral reason to help him, let's say, or you do have this. If we kind of think again that there's this kind of relationship, right, and in virtue of that relationship, you have this kind of duty or whatever, right? That you have a reason. See, I shouldn't have used a friend, but that anybody who's in pain, that you're interested in helping people who have pain. Well, because they have pain, but you don't know about it, you still are going to count as having a reason because they're in pain, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious to know your thoughts, Mike. But the first question that comes to my mind is like, so are we saying that it just doesn't, like, does it matter or not matter that that I know he's in pain? Because wouldn't it be the case that I still have, this stance dependent view that I want to help a friend in need?
Right. Because the reason can't be reduced to a motivation, right? And because you can only have subjective reasons in virtue of having motivations, that gives us maybe an epistemic reason to think that there are these stance-independent reasons.
Yeah. So I have a issue with reason talk in general. So me and Jordan like briefly talked about kind of this because I remember when we were talking like 3 a.m. on a TikTok or whatever, you proposed this question. So wait, do you deny like categorical epistemic reasons as well? And I was like, yeah, I take that on. And I know some people kind of like open their eyes when that's said, but so for me, I'm kind of weirded out in general on this reason talk. So the parfait kind of view is going to be strange to someone like me if someone still insists that I have a reason and independent of some motivation or other reasons I have, right? To me, that's what I said this before the live, that my anti-realism could be totally dependent on a failure of my understanding of when people talk about stance-independent reasons. I mean, typically the realist I'm talking about like these stance-independent, normative, these moral reasons. But even on the epistemic, I have reasons to do these things. I'm left there not understanding what a reason is, independent of like my stances. So the way that I relate this, we won't hopefully get, because we're towards the end here, and my neck's about to give out on me, so I'll give this before we end up wrapping up. But the struggle I have is that imagine someone came up to you and said that Jordan is taller. And a way that a lot of people are going to interpret this is that there's some type of referentiality built into this. So he's taller than the tree, or maybe he's taller than he was last week, or maybe he's taller than Aaron. But you'll be using this than, you'll be using this word than, right? To denote some type of referentiality, which is totally coherent, right? Similarly, I understand what it means for me to have epistemic reasons, or, I should go get some more milk because I'm out. I really like milk. I understand this kind of reason talk. But when you divorce the reason talk from the stances or motivations that I have, it's hard for me to understand what's being expressed. The same way if somebody divorced referentiality from tallerness, and they said, well, Jordan's taller, and I said, oh, so he's taller than Aaron, or taller than that tree, or taller than he was last week. And they go, no referentiality. In fact, my view kind of strips that away. Now, I don't know that I'm representing Parfit here well. I'm just trying to do my best with the epistemic reasons to give where I get lost. That I think that if I ask somebody, do you understand what I'm saying when I say that Jordan's taller? What they should report back to me is no. I don't have any clue what's being expressed there. Now, if you put the referentiality back in, I do. And I think the same thing for me is like any reason talk that's kind of floating, so to speak, or independent of my motivations or stances seems odd to me. But I do recognize and understand that, this isn't like an objection to Parfit's view, and Parfit's going to insist more. Like, no, look, you don't want the cyanide. Like, like he's going to say these kind of things. And I recognize that. So when I say this is not a criticism towards Parfit's view by any means, as much as it's when we encroach the kind of reason talk and we divorce it from that, I start to get a little bit lost on whether or not what we're talking about is even propositional. Now, I do want to say this as well. I haven't even told Aaron this, so I'm going to say this for the Light of Reason viewers, that I've already reached out to Lance Bush, who's a PhD in moral psychology, and I can't remember what it is with philosophy that he has degree-wise. I should know because I can consider him a friend. I've talked with him a good amount of times and done some TikTok lives and interviewed him. He will be on this show. Aaron doesn't know it yet, but he's going to be on this show, and he talks a lot about the Parfit view, and so we can get into those weeds there. But what I'm saying isn't an objection. So I don't have much to say about the Parfit view as much as like when we get into these kind of reason talk, this is kind of where my brain goes, and there might just be a failure on my part to understand. I don't know if that's enough or if that actually helps at all, but maybe it'll just give people an insight to how I view this reason talk and how it only kind of makes sense when it's intimately related with my stances and motivations.
Yeah. In the next episode, we'll talk a lot about like the basic theories, like the overall basic theories in metaethics, right? So we'll start to go down those rabbit trails a lot more. But yeah, at least like we're opening up a lot of can of worms that a lot of people can go and dig on their own until the next one. But Jordan, what are your thoughts on the things he touched on just now?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is like, at least in the case of the practical stance independent reasons, right, is that there is it's not entirely divorced from your stances, right, in the sense of there is this kind of relation, right? There's a kind of
you're not getting you're going to want to say you're not getting rid of the relation in the way that I want to characterize the referentiality bit, which is what I'm trying to hopefully like get across that I'm recognizing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that like it's almost kind of, there's a kind of modalness, like there's a kind of modal claim also in there, right? Where modal, just to be clear for the viewers, it's
hard, isn't
relating
it?
to
it's hard. It's so hard.
Relating to like possibility, right? Necessity. Yeah. So anytime that you say like I can do this, you're making like I can jump.
Modal expressions. I could do this. I couldn't do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do this a lot, and people don't really realize how many modal expressions we actually say. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's deep within the way that we think.
Yeah.
They pertain to possibility and impossibility and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You can't traverse an infinite, right? Someone's saying like, hey, there's some impossibility or something, right? There's no world where this could happen, kind of a thing.
That'll be a fun future topic.
Oh God, yeah. I'm like so less in the moral philosophy, but I love it. I don't know much about it, so I'm really depending on Jordan here for a lot of it. But yeah, we're gonna have great. I'm having a blast, so I'm loving this.
But there's this kind of conditionality in the sense of, it depends on you, right? Wanting to be alive, right? Mm-hmm. But it says like independent of your current motivations, right? If you want to stay alive, then you have a reason, independent of your motivations, to not take the cyanide, right? Where this is going to be tricky for moral realists, right, from moving from the practical to the moral is it's categoricalness, right? Meaning it's, you know, something that's, so the practical, right? It's if you want to stay alive, then don't take the cyanide, right? Where on a lot of more realistic accounts, it's not just that. It's not going to depend on your
independent standard that you have to satisfy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
And that's going to be trickier. Now, some moral realists are not committed to this kind of categoricalness, right?
Which, by the way, is just highlighting where my own tensions are. Is really right there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Which early Philippa Foot is an example of that. She just said, "Okay, then I'll just if categoricalness is, you know, this kind of universal statement applying to, you know, everybody is the problem, then that's what I'll give up, right?" Mm-hmm. But the worry there is that it's like it makes things too weak, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, well, I guess sort of in a roundabout way, capping off on this idea, it's like I don't want to like underemphasize the reality that there's so much debate and disagreement, right? That like you have the moral realists in the philosophical literature, and the anti-realists are going to like push back, and then they're going to push back, right? And then you've got the non-cognitivism to push back, and perhaps like when we're talking about like this definition of this question of what is goodness and so forth, there's still this like much disagreement about what is goodness, how to define it, how to even think about it, right?
Right.
It seems super interesting of a question.
I would hope, like, if someone never thought about these questions and then just listened to this, that they'd go, wow, there's a lot more under the hood than I thought. Even, you know, I'm not even saying, like, specifically us, like anything if you get into this domain, I just hope that's kind of your takeaway, because I think it's underestimated in a lot of ways, like what can be said about certain concepts just in general, and what goes, how much we take certain, you know, term usage for granted without really recognize what we might be committed to or saying, or right. There's just so much there, and it's not enough just to go, well, hey, I think these philosophers are just talking philosopho garbage. You can't really critique it unless you understand it, and so and it's funny how a lot of people, when they get into it, they end up not going the route of back to where they were in that. They just go more into it, and they seem to want to digest more. And that's because I think there's a lot of interesting things to say, even if you don't end up committing to a particular view. And what's great thing about this is you don't have to, right? You don't have to commit to some one of the views that we said earlier. You could be like, I'm not even sure if I'm a realist or anti-realist. You don't owe anybody, you know, anything on your navigation in philosophy, because it's a lifelong project. So
right. Yeah, I like that idea too. Like I experienced this like first philosophy class ever, which was, you know, it totally dates me. It was like 1997, 98 or something, right? And you wind up thinking like, well, you wind up discovering that like in philosophy, we take like almost nothing for granted, right?
Yeah. You try to stop doing that. Yeah.
Just like you're not going to take anything for granted.
Yeah.
And I'll cap off this episode by giving a quick story. My first philosophy class ever was a junior college in Southern California. And the moment after the instructor took the roll, he walked over to the wall and he flipped out the lights. So it was pitch black dark. And he said, now I want you guys to prove to me that the television is actually still there. And we spent the entire class debating about it, in which case can't take it for granted. And it was fascinating. It was interesting. Of course, I got the bug bit me there. So yeah, this is fun. This has been great. I appreciate you guys joining me today.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. If you can get into philosophy without having philosophy of religion be your introduction, I think you'll have the most pure way of doing it. I'm not saying that towards like being a theist or an atheist. I'm just saying outside of the philosophy of religion domain is a beautiful landscape, and inside the philosophy of religion domain, it can be, but it can also, you get so I just find that discussing mereology with other philosophers about I'm not calling myself a philosopher, but philosophers in this, is a different taste and a much better taste than some other areas. So that's also beauty. You don't have to commit to one. You can just really love philosophy of science. I mean, it's gonna be great because it'll leak into other areas that you'll eventually find yourself in. So
Yeah. Before we close, J. Mike and Jordan, tell the viewers where they can find you.
Sure. I do about 1 or 2 shows a month on Atheist Experience. So you can just go to Atheist Experience. You can find me here. I'll be here, co-doing it along with Jordan and Aaron. So you can find me here, obviously. TikTok, if you really were weird and you really cared about me and you want to see me more often, then just _ JMike on TikTok. You'll find me in live debates with people or discussing philosophy with some of my philosophy friends. And you can just stay tuned for Ganchman stuff, some music stuff. So basically that's where you can find me. Oh, and also let me do a quick shout out. I think June 22nd, I'll be doing a show with Seth Andrews. So if you're familiar with Seth Andrews, and it's not philosophy related at all, but if you know Seth Andrews and the powerhouse that he is and his beautiful voice, then it'll be really nice to see you watch us. So join us.
Cool.
And you can find me. I'm primarily on TikTok at But It Got Better. And I got a lot of metaethics stuff, a lot of videos on that. And if you kind of want to do like a little bit of a deeper dive, I also teach a logic class on a Discord. So if logic is something you're interested in, let me know.
Yep. In the show notes, in the description box below, if you're interested in either one of us, I'll put all the links to contact us, appropriate stuff. So, okay, guys.
Now you just have to decide based on what you understood. Was this a good episode? No, I'm sorry. I had to do it.
That's right.
Classic.
Yeah.
Okay, guys.
Stance Independently good podcast. And yes, you have Stance Independent reasons to subscribe and like.
That's right. Like and subscribe. Till next time.